Hi, welcome to the Pre-Snore History Hub. This video is all about the peace negotiations. So what happened between 1968 and 73 in terms of peace negotiations? So following the Tet Offensive in 1968, President Johnson suggested peace negotiations should begin. And much to his surprise, the North Vietnamese actually accepted his offer. Talks began in Paris in 1968. Johnson halted the bombing of North Vietnam and was hopeful that a peace agreement could be negotiated in a reasonable amount of time. For months, there was absolutely no progress in the talks as each side haggled over minor issues such as the shape and size of the meeting table, where people would sit, who would be in the meetings, whether they would have small flags on the table, and other really silly petty issues. One major issue confronting the negotiators was the inclusion of the South Vietnamese Communists as a separate negotiating group. South Vietnamese President Thieu did not want them at any meetings because he knew this gave the Viet Cong legal status. The Viet Cong had no form of government, no recognised leader, and had disrupted life in South Vietnam. Nonetheless, they were granted an official position at the table. Neither side was prepared to move from their stance, and no progress was made for several months. The USA wanted South Vietnam to be independent and non-communist. North Vietnam wanted Vietnam reunified as one country, a communist government in place. Once Nixon came to power, he promised to end the war. So, what were these secret talks that happened? Nixon initially held talks with both China and the USSR, hoping to end the Cold War. As a result, North Vietnam, fearing an end to aid from these countries, agreed to secret peace talks. In July of 1969, President Nixon authorized Henry Kissinger, the US National Security Advisor, to open secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese only. The South did not know about these talks. The USA was considering abandoning the South Vietnamese government led by President Thieu if they could get an agreement on an independent South Vietnam. Nixon was hopeful that they could make advances without the other two parties directly involved. North Vietnam made it clear that they would not accept any government led by Thieu. The talks went nowhere and each side continued military action to try to improve its negotiating position. So what were the actual demands of each side? Perhaps the biggest stumbling block to the peace talks for the Americans was, ironically enough, the peace movement in the USA. The North Vietnamese closely followed the protests and the riots in the USA and would read US newspaper articles to the US diplomats whenever they met. Their message was consistent. The US public would force their troops out of Vietnam and the North need only wait them out. University demonstrations and protests, together with a biased press, resulted in the USA's negotiating team becoming virtually powerless. For nearly 4 years, the peace talks stuttered and meandered with no major breakthroughs. So this is what the four sides demanded in the peace negotiations. So the USA wanted the withdrawal of US and North Vietnamese forces from South Vietnam. They wanted to allow South Vietnamese people to work out their own political problems without the influence of the North, and they wanted all prisoners of war to be released. The North Vietnamese wanted the USA to remove forces immediately and unconditionally, the resignation of President Thieu. The official South Vietnamese government, so the one led by Thieu, wanted an immediate and unconditional removal of North Vietnamese forces. They wanted South Vietnam to have one leader, not a coalition government. The South Vietnamese Communists, also known as the Viet Cong or the NLF, wanted immediate removal of US forces, the Viet Cong forces to stay in positions already under their control, and the resignation of President Thieu. So, moving towards restarting talks. Nixon felt the USA had to seem willing to negotiate, but should also be strong enough not to be pushed to accept unfavourable peace terms. From 1970, he kept pressure on North Vietnam to agree to peace by 1. Continuing official negotiations, 2. Continuing also with secret negotiations, 3. Continuing the process of Vietnamization. What you can watch the video on Vietnamization if you want more information on what that actually was. 4. Continuing the fighting and bombing. There's also another video on the bombing of the North. Continuing meetings with the USSR and China, negotiating an end to the Cold War. The most significant problem Nixon's actions created for North Vietnam was the possibility that they might lose China and the USSR's support, as they too had begun to put pressure on them to make peace with the USA. Congress was cutting funding and opposition to the war was rising. People were tired of war and the amount of time it was taking to bring the troops home. In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched their Easter offensive. It was a shock to the US government that they were strong enough to launch this attack, even though it failed. This and the US bombing showed that both sides that the war could drag on for years. So, what was the breakthrough in negotiations? The whole peace movement changed when Nixon visited China in February 1972. Both China and the Soviet Union, the two major communist countries at the time, were supporting North Vietnam, but neither country necessarily trusted the other. Nixon's trip helped exploit the divisions between China and the Soviet Union, as well as the divisions between China and Vietnam. USA-Soviet Union relations had improved following the Moscow summit in May 1972, when Nixon became the first US president to visit the Soviet capital. The leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, and his advisors acted as an intermediary between Hanoi and Washington. This was a period in the Cold War known as Détente, which saw an improvement in relations. Brezhnev used his role in Vietnam not only to further enhance détente and improve relations with America, but also to show that the Soviet Union had a more influential position over Vietnam than China. On October 8, 1972, the USA and North Vietnam produced an agreement at the official Paris talks, agreed in their secret meetings. Trump refused to sign. He was furious that he had played no part in the making of the agreement he was being forced to sign. The North Vietnamese accused the US of using South Vietnam's refusal to back out of the agreement. The talks broke up with the agreement unsigned and increased lack of trust on all sides. Once again, Nixon tried several things to press for the peace talks to restart. He tried the USA resuming heavy bombing of North Vietnam. Nixon encouraged China and the USSR to press the North Vietnamese to reach an agreement. Nixon persuaded President Thieu to come to talks by promising an immediate delivery of weapons, supplies, and aid. Talks began again on the 8th of January 1973. Don't forget to subscribe to the Personal History Hub. The next video is going to be about the Paris Peace Agreement.